What does a person trade when they trade the years of their life for a wage they already know will never be enough? What happens to the mind of a man or a woman who wakes up every single morning already defeated, already knowing, somewhere deep in the jaw where tension lives and never fully releases, that the numbers will not add up again this month? And here's the question that cuts deepest of all, the one most people spend enormous energy avoiding. What if the cage was never locked from the outside? Sit with that. Because that question, that specific and uncomfortable question, is the one Napoleon Hill spent more than 20 years investigating. And what he found, what he extracted from the lives of more than 500 of the wealthiest and most consequential men of his era, is something that most people in this world will go to their graves never knowing. Not because it was hidden from them, not because they lacked the intelligence to grasp it, but because they never stayed long enough in the right conversation to hear it all the way through. This is that conversation. And if you leave before it is finished, if you walk away from these next several minutes the same way you have walked away from 100 other moments of potential transformation, then what is lost is not a collection of clever ideas. What is lost is a version of your life that was genuinely structurally possible. A version where your children grow up watching you choose rather than watching you endure. A version where the word legacy means something specific and real when it is attached to your name. So stay. Because the 70-30 rule, the principle at the heart of everything you are about to learn, is not a budgeting trick. It is not a spreadsheet formula. It is a law of the mind, a law that Hill discovered by sitting in the presence of Carnegie and Ford and Rockefeller and asking them, relentlessly and without apology, the same fundamental question: what is the invisible architecture of a mind that produces wealth, and how does a person deliberately build it? The answer will surprise you. Or rather, the answer will confirm something you have sensed for a long time, but were never given the precise language to name. Begin here. Begin with the ordinary Tuesday morning that most people reading this or listening to this know with a familiarity that borders on physical pain. The alarm sounds, the body, still carrying the fatigue of the previous week, surfaces into consciousness. And before a single thought is formed, before a single decision is made, before the eyes have fully adjusted to the light, the mind has already begun its habitual broadcast. The same channel, the same frequency. The calculations that go. The rent is due on the 15th. The car needs work. The oldest child has an expense coming, and the paycheck arrives on the 22nd, which means 7 days of arithmetic that will not balance. This is not a story about laziness. Let that be absolutely clear. The person living inside that Tuesday morning is often one of the hardest working people in any room they enter. They are disciplined enough to show up. They are responsible enough to pay what they owe. They carry obligations with a seriousness that many wealthy people, frankly, have never had to develop. And yet the hard work compounds into more hard work, and the responsibility deepens into more obligation, and the years begin to pass with a velocity that is frankly terrifying once a person stops long enough to notice it. That is the trap, not the poverty itself, not the scarcity of money. The trap is the mind that has been trained through repetition and environment and unexamined belief to produce the experience of scarcity over and over again, regardless of the effort applied. Hill saw this. He documented it with the precision of a scientist and the urgency of a man who understood that the cost of this particular ignorance was measured not in dollars, but in human lives, in whole generations, in children who inherit not only their parents' financial position, but their parents' internal relationship with money, with possibility, with their own worth. If you have ever felt that weight, that specific heaviness at the back of the neck when you think about what you're passing down rather than what you're building up, then you already understand, at a cellular level, why this matters. And if this channel has been part of your search for something more than the life that was handed to you, if you have been sitting with these ideas and feeling them move something real inside you, then do one thing right now. Subscribe, not as a formality. Subscribe the way a person who has found the right teacher subscribes to their teaching, with intention, with the understanding that the mind, as Hill demonstrated beyond reasonable argument, is shaped by what it is repeatedly exposed to. What you feed your mind daily is not a trivial choice. It is the foundational act of financial self-determination. And leave a comment below telling us this. What is the one financial belief you inherited from your family that you know in your gut is keeping you small? Because the conversation in the comments of this channel is itself a form of what Hill called the mastermind. And that principle is one of the most powerful in his entire philosophy. We will return to the mastermind. But first, we need to understand the full weight of what is at stake. And that requires honesty. The kind of honesty that is not comfortable here is what Hill found when he studied the lives of people who died in financial mediocrity despite having the intelligence and the capacity for something far greater. He found not a lack of talent, he found a lack of decision. A decision that was never made or was made and then quietly abandoned when the first resistance appeared. And the consequence of that unmade decision does not stay contained within the individual. It radiates outward, it touches everyone in proximity to that person. Think about this with the full weight of your attention. Your children are watching you right now, not just watching what you do with money, though, that matters enormously. They are watching what you do with your fear. They are watching whether you let the discomfort of growth stop you or whether you walk through it. They are watching whether the word possibility is something that lives in your house as a real active force, or whether it is something that gets quietly suffocated by the daily management of scarcity. The research, and Hill spent decades accumulating it, is unambiguous. The beliefs a child absorbs about money, about their own capacity to create it, about whether the world is a place of abundance or a place of threat, those beliefs are formed before the age of 10. They are encoded in the subconscious with a permanence that makes them feel like facts rather than inherited opinions, and they are passed from generation to generation, not through conversation, but through atmosphere, through the energy in the kitchen when the bills arrive, through the words used to describe wealthy people, through the look on a parent's face when a child dares to dream large. If your parents passed this to you, you're not here to blame them. They passed what they were given. But you are here, in this moment, with this information, which means the chain can be broken. The question is whether you will break it. And the clock on that question is not infinite, because here is what Hill observed in the lives of the men and women who waited too long. The mind hardens. Not in a metaphorical sense, in a very real neurological sense. The longer a belief system goes unchallenged, the more deeply it is grooved into the architecture of thought. The person who is 45 and has spent 2.5 decades rehearsing the belief that wealth is for other people, that financial freedom is a fantasy for the lucky, that they are simply not the type, that person does not find it impossible to change. But they find it harder than the person who changes at 30, and harder still than the person who changes at 25. This is not said to discourage anyone. It is said because the urgency is real. The window is not closed, but the window is not infinite. And the person who sits in front of this information and says, "I will come back to this when things settle down," is making a decision whose consequences they have not yet fully calculated. Let us calculate them now. If you're 35 years old today and you continue on the current trajectory for another decade without making the internal shifts Hill identified as foundational, then at 45 you will have spent 10 more years compounding the exact mental patterns that produce today's financial position. The debt will be older. The opportunities that required a younger body and a more elastic sense of possibility will have narrowed. The children, if you have them, will be older, and the window during which your transformation can become the defining story of their childhood will have partially closed. And somewhere in the palms of your hands, in that subtle tension that appears when the mind confronts something it knows is true and wishes were not, you already feel the accuracy of this. That is not fear for its own sake. That is Hill's methodology applied honestly. He believed, and the evidence of 500 lives confirmed it for him, that a person must feel the full weight of the cost of inaction before they can generate the kind of desire that is strong enough to actually produce change. He called it burning desire, and he was precise about what that means. It is not enthusiasm, it is not motivation, which is a feeling that comes and goes with the weather. It is a decision made at a level deep enough that it begins to reorganize the subconscious mind around a new dominant thought. And this is where the 70-30 rule enters. This is the architecture underneath everything. Hill did not present the 70-30 rule as a budgeting formula, though it has budgetary implications. He presented it as a description of how the mind of a wealthy person is fundamentally oriented differently from the mind of a person who remains poor, and how that orientation can be deliberately constructed by anyone willing to do the internal work with sufficient consistency. Here's the principle in its simplest form. 70% of the mental energy of a financially free person is directed toward creation, growth, possibility, and service. 30% is directed toward management, protection, and the maintenance of what already exists. In the mind of a person trapped in financial scarcity, those proportions are inverted, and then some 80, 90, sometimes 100% of mental bandwidth is consumed by management, by survival, by the maintenance of a situation that is already inadequate. There is no space left for the creative, expansive, generative thought that produces new wealth. Or rather, let me put it another way, because the distinction matters enormously. It is not that the person in scarcity lacks creative capacity. It is that the chronic stress of financial insecurity biochemically suppresses access to exactly the regions of the mind where creative, strategic, long-term thinking lives. This is not a moral judgment. This is a description of how the mind works under threat. And the person who does not understand this mechanism will spend their entire life blaming themselves for a cognitive limitation that was never a character flaw. It was a neurological consequence of operating in a state of perpetual financial alarm. Hill understood this intuitively in ways that neuroscience has since confirmed. He wrote about the subconscious mind as a garden that grows whatever is planted in it, whether the seeds are chosen consciously or whether they blow in from the environment. The person who lives under chronic financial stress is not consciously choosing to plant seeds of scarcity. But the environment they are immersed in, the conversations they have, the news they consume, the social circles they inhabit, those environments are planting those seeds continuously and powerfully, without the person's awareness or consent. This is why the 70-30 rule is first and foremost a mental discipline before it is a financial one. Now, there was a man Hill worked with for a period in the 1920s. I will not use his real name, as that is not the point of the story, but I will tell you what I observed in the course of researching this material deeply. I will call him Robert. Robert came from a family of coal miners in western Pennsylvania. Not a man with formal education, not a man with connections or inherited capital, but a man who had, at a certain point in his 30s, come into contact with Hill's principles and made a decision that his biographers later described as almost frightening in its totality. Robert sat across from an interviewer in a small room with a single window and said the following. He said, "I decided that every thought about what I did not have was a thought stolen from what I was building, and I stopped allowing the theft." That sentence, that exact construction, stayed with me for a long time, because it captures something that Hill spent hundreds of pages trying to articulate. The mind has a finite bandwidth at any given moment. Every unit of attention devoted to scarcity, to lack, to what is missing, to what might go wrong is a unit of attention that is not available for the construction of the mental image that precedes every real-world result. Hill called this mental image the definite major purpose, and it is the cornerstone of the entire philosophy. Most people, when they think about what they want financially, think in generalities. They think, I want to be comfortable, I want to have enough, I want to stop worrying about money. These are not purposes. These are the absence of pain. And the mind, the subconscious mind specifically, does not organize itself around the absence of pain. It organizes itself around a clear, specific, emotionally charged image of a desired result. The difference between a person who drifts through financial life and a person who directs it is precisely this. The person who directs it has given their subconscious mind a specific instruction, a number, a date, a clear picture. And they have charged that picture with enough emotional intensity, enough feeling, that the subconscious begins to treat it as a command rather than a wish. Here is how Hill prescribed doing this, drawn directly from his documented methodology. Write down, in specific numerical terms, the exact amount of money you intend to possess. Not the amount you hope for, not the amount you think is realistic. The amount that when you read it produces a sensation in the base of your throat, a kind of vibration between wanting and believing. That specific sensation is important. It indicates that the number is large enough to engage the deeper layers of the mind, but specific enough to be real. Then write down the exact date by which you intend to possess it. Then write down in detail precisely what you intend to give in return for it. Because Hill was unambiguous on this point, the universe or the mechanism of the subconscious does not respond to desire alone. It responds to desire attached to a clear value proposition. What service will you render? What product will you create? What problem will you solve? What unique capacity will you develop and bring to a market that needs it? Then write a clear, concise plan for how you will begin immediately, even if that plan is incomplete. The plan will evolve, but the act of committing a plan to paper signals to the subconscious that this is not fantasy. It is construction. And then read that written statement aloud with full emotional investment twice every day. Once in the morning, before the mind has been colonized by the day's demands. Once in the evening as the last instruction given to the subconscious before it goes to work during sleep. This is auto-suggestion, and it is one of the most underestimated tools in the entire architecture of wealth creation. Most people, when they first encounter this practice, resist it. The rational mind objects, it says this is just affirmations. This is positive thinking. This is not serious. And this specific objection, is itself evidence of the very mental conditioning Hill was trying to address. Because the resistance to deliberately planting a thought is always highest in people whose subconscious has been most thoroughly colonized by the opposite thought. The louder the internal voice that says this is foolish, the more urgently the practice is needed. Bueno, mejor dicho, it is not that the practice is magical, it is that the mind is already engaged in autosuggestion every single day. Every anxious thought about money that runs on repeat through the mind during a sleepless night is a form of autosuggestion. Every time a person says out loud or internally that money is tight, or that they never have enough, or that wealthy people are different from them in some fundamental way, that is autosuggestion. The only question is whether the person is choosing the suggestion, or whether the suggestion is being chosen for them by circumstance and habit. Hill's method is simply the deliberate reclamation of a process that is already happening. It is the decision to become the author of the instruction rather than the passive receiver of it. And this is where the 70-30th principle becomes a daily practice rather than an abstract concept. 70% of the mental time in practice means this: before the mind is given permission to dwell on problems, on lack, on what is not working, it must first be given 30 minutes, ideally at the start of the day, in which it is directed exclusively toward the vision, the definite major purpose, the specific financial target, the service that will be rendered in exchange, the plan, however incomplete, that is already in motion. This is not denial of problems. Problems are real, and they require attention. But the person who begins their day with 30 minutes of directed, purposeful thought toward their vision, before engaging with the problems, has fundamentally altered the neurological lens through which those problems are then perceived. A problem viewed from within a scarcity mindset appears as evidence of permanent limitation. The same problem viewed from within an abundance orientation appears as a specific obstacle with a specific solution that has not yet been found. The mind finds what it is primed to find. This is not philosophy. This is the documented function of the reticular activating system, the part of the brain that determines what information from the environment gets flagged as relevant and brought to conscious attention. And it is set primarily by the dominant thoughts the mind is rehearsing. Feed the mind scarcity, and it will find evidence of scarcity everywhere it looks. Feed it a clear, specific, emotionally charged vision of abundance, and it will begin, reliably, and with increasing power, to notice opportunities, connections, ideas, and resources that were always present in the environment, but invisible to a mind tuned to a different frequency. This is what Hill meant when he wrote that thoughts are things, not in a mystical sense, in a functional, operational sense. The thought you hold with the most frequency and the most emotional intensity becomes the organizing principle of your perception. And perception, as every great achiever in Hill's research confirmed, is the true determinant of financial outcome. Now let us talk about the mastermind principle, because it is inseparable from everything we have discussed, and it is the element most commonly omitted by people who study Hill's work in isolation. Hill was explicit. No individual mind, however powerful and however well-trained, possesses all of the knowledge, all of the perspective, and all of the creative capacity required to build substantial wealth alone. The most powerful financial achievements in history, without exception, were built through the coordinated effort of more than one mind aligned around a common purpose and operating with what Hill described as a spirit of harmony and mutual benefit. Andrew Carnegie built an industrial empire worth, in today's terms, hundreds of billions of dollars. But Carnegie himself told Hill directly that he would not have built a fraction of it without the mastermind group he had assembled around him. Men of different disciplines, different strengths, different networks, aligned around a shared vision and meeting with regularity, and with the explicit intention of creating something none of them could create alone. This principle has a direct application in the life of anyone listening to this right now, regardless of their current financial position. The people you spend time with, the conversations you regularly participate in, the collective beliefs of your closest social circle, these are not peripheral to your financial life. They are constitutive of it. They are actively shaping the ceiling of what your subconscious believes is possible. Bueno, and this is not comfortable to say, because it touches something most people would rather leave untouched, but Hill documented it too clearly to soften it. If the 5 people closest to you in your daily life do not have a burning relationship with financial growth, if scarcity is the default language of your social environment, then you're fighting an uphill battle that is far steeper than it needs to be. Not because those people are bad, but because the subconscious mind does not distinguish between a thought planted by choice and a thought absorbed from the environment. It treats them equally. It acts on them with equal force. The construction of a mastermind group, even in its most modest form, is one of the most powerful and most undervalued actions a person can take. 2 or 3 people who share a serious commitment to financial growth, who meet regularly, who challenge each other's thinking, who share resources and connections and ideas with genuine generosity. That small group generates a collective intelligence that is qualitatively different from and more powerful than the sum of its individual parts. Hill observed this effect in the relationships between the great industrialists he studied. He observed it in the alliance between Edison and Ford, who met regularly and whose conversations produced a quality of thinking that neither generated in isolation. He observed it in the early partnerships that built the railroads and the steel industry and the financial architecture of the early 20th century. And he concluded, with the certainty of a man who has seen the pattern repeat without exception, that the mastermind is not a luxury for people who have already achieved wealth. It is a prerequisite for the achievement of it. So the question becomes, who is in your mastermind? And if the honest answer is that no such group currently exists in your life, then the construction of one is not an abstract aspiration. It is a concrete, actionable, immediate next step. And here is something that very few people who discuss Hill's work choose to examine, perhaps because it requires a degree of self-confrontation that is genuinely uncomfortable. The reason most people never form a mastermind group, never commit a definite major purpose to paper, never begin the daily practice of autosuggestion with real discipline is not that they lack information. It is that at some level, below the level of conscious thought, somewhere behind the eyes in that place where the mind's real conversations with itself happen, they do not believe they are the kind of person for whom these things work. And that belief, that specific subterranean conviction, is the final and most important thing to address. Hill called this the subconscious money blueprint. The internal, largely invisible set of beliefs about what a person like them, from a background like theirs, with a history like theirs, is entitled to create. And he was unambiguous. This blueprint, not talent, not opportunity, not effort, is the primary determinant of lifetime financial outcome. Because every external strategy, every business plan, every investment thesis, every networking effort will be unconsciously self-sabotaged by a person whose internal blueprint says that the destination those strategies are pointed toward is not available to someone like them. See. This is what Hill meant when he wrote about the law of the subconscious mind and its tendency to reject information that is inconsistent with its dominant beliefs. The person who has a deep, unexamined conviction that wealthy people are different in some essential, unchosen way, whether smarter, luckier, more ruthless, born into the right circumstances, that person will find a way unconsciously but reliably to undermine every strategy that threatens to prove that conviction wrong. The reprogramming of this blueprint is the real work, and it is work that happens in the 30 minutes at the start of the day, in the deliberate practice of reading the written definite major purpose with full emotional engagement. It happens in the careful curation of the social environment, the construction of the mastermind, the replacement of scarcity-coded conversations with abundance-coded ones. It happens in the decision made fresh every morning to give 70% of the available mental energy to creation and possibility before giving even a single unit of it to survival and management. Is this easy? No. Let us be absolutely honest about that. The mind that has spent 20 or 30 years rehearsing a particular set of beliefs does not release them in a week of morning affirmations. The reprogramming is real work. It requires consistency over a period of months, not days. It requires the willingness to sit with discomfort, to notice the internal voice that says, this is not working, this is foolish. You are not the type, and to continue the practice anyway, with the understanding that the resistance itself is evidence that the old blueprint is being challenged. But here's what Hill also documented, and what makes the work worth doing beyond any shadow of doubt. The subconscious mind, once it has accepted a new dominant belief with sufficient depth, does not shift gradually. It shifts with a speed and a totality that astonishes the person experiencing it. The opportunities that were always present but invisible suddenly become visible. The connections that were always available but unnoticed suddenly present themselves. The ideas that were dormant in the mind suddenly crystallize into plans. The energy that was being consumed by the management of scarcity suddenly becomes available for creation. This is what Hill's subjects described, almost universally, as the turning point. Not a single dramatic external event, but an internal shift. a moment when the subconscious mind crossed a threshold of belief and the entire world appeared to rearrange itself in response. Au más bien, the world did not rearrange itself. The person's perception of it did. And since perception determines action and action determines outcome, the practical effect is indistinguishable from the world having changed. Now let us address something that Hill discussed with particular force, and that has particular relevance for anyone in this audience who carries the weight of family obligation, the weight of being responsible for people who depend on them. The fear of financial failure. When a person has children, when they have a partner, when they have people who need them to succeed, that fear can be so overwhelming that it paradoxically prevents the very actions that would relieve it. The mind, locked in survival mode, contracts. It becomes risk-averse in the deepest sense, not just financially risk-averse, but imaginatively risk-averse. The vision narrows. The definite major purpose, if it was ever articulated, begins to seem irresponsible, grandiose, disconnected from the pressing realities of the household budget. And the children watch this happen. They do not have the language for what they are watching, but they feel it in the atmosphere of the home. They absorb it through the conversations that stop when they enter the room. They internalize it as a fact about the world, that the responsible thing is to reduce your expectations to a size that matches your fear. This is the inheritance that breaks Hill's heart. Not poverty itself, not the absence of money in a particular generation, but the transmission of a diminished relationship with possibility from parent to child, generation after generation, because no one ever stopped long enough to identify the belief at the root of the pattern and decide, with full consciousness and full authority, to plant something different. You have that authority. It is not given to you by any external institution or circumstance. It is intrinsic. It is the fundamental human capacity to choose the dominant contents of the mind. Hill documented 500 men who exercised that capacity and built fortunes that altered the course of industries and nations. He also documented the far larger number who never exercised it, who lived and died with their potential intact and undeployed, leaving behind not the legacy they were capable of, but the echo of a life spent managing the consequences of an unexamined belief. Which of those two descriptions do you want attached to your name? Because here's what the 70-30 rule ultimately comes down to at the deepest level of its application. It is a daily decision about the proportion of yourself you will give to the life you have versus the proportion you will give to the life you are building. And that decision is made not once, in a moment of inspiration, but repeatedly, in the small and unglamorous moments of every ordinary day. In the moment when the mind wants to catastrophize about the bill and you choose instead to direct it toward the solution. In the moment when the social environment offers scarcity as the default conversation and you choose instead to raise the frequency. In the moment when the old blueprint whispers that this is not for you and you choose instead to read the written purpose aloud with the full force of your intention. These are not large, dramatic gestures. They are small, consistent, cumulative acts of mental self-determination. But they compound with exactly the same mathematics as financial interest. And with exactly the same power. The mind that practices this for 30 days is different from the mind that started. The mind that practices it for 90 days is different in ways that begin to manifest in the external world, in conversations, in opportunities, in the quality of decisions made. The mind that practices it for a year has crossed the threshold that Hill's subjects described as the turning point. And the mind that practices it for 5 years has become functionally and measurably a different instrument. Hill also spoke about the principle of faith, and it is important to clarify what he meant, because the word carries associations that can obscure its practical meaning. When Hill wrote about faith as a component of wealth creation, he meant something precise, the ability to act as though the desired result is already achieved, with enough emotional consistency and behavioral commitment that the subconscious mind accepts it as a current reality rather than a future. Hope. This is not self-deception. It is deliberate neurological training. The subconscious mind does not have a reliable sense of the difference between a vividly imagined experience and an actual one. This is why trauma experienced once can produce symptoms that recur for decades. The mind rehearsed the experience so thoroughly in the replaying of memory that it encoded it as a present-tense reality. The same mechanism applied deliberately to a desired future produces what Hill called faith, the neurological conviction that the outcome is not merely possible, but inevitable. And from that conviction, decisions are made differently. The opportunity that a person with a scarcity blueprint would dismiss as too risky is recognized by a person with a wealth blueprint as a calculated step toward a known destination. The rejection that would discourage a person whose subconscious has not accepted the outcome as inevitable is experienced by a person whose subconscious has accepted it as simply a data point in a navigation system that is still on course. This is the difference between the people Hill studied who built lasting wealth and those who did not. Not intelligence, not education, not even. In most cases, initial advantage, the difference was in the relationship between the conscious intention and the subconscious conviction. When those two were aligned, when what the person consciously desired was also what the subconscious believed was inevitable, the result was what appears from the outside as extraordinary luck, exceptional timing, uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right moment. And when they were misaligned, when the conscious mind desired wealth, while the subconscious continued to broadcast the belief that wealth was for other people, the result was the maddening pattern that millions of people have experienced. Working hard, doing the right things on the surface, and somehow consistently arriving at the same inadequate outcome. As Desir, the problem was never the plan. The problem was the planner's internal relationship with the plan's destination. Quiero decir, the strategy was never the limiting factor. The mind behind the strategy was, now let us be specific about the practical application of the 70-30 rule at the level of daily life, because Hill was always, beneath the philosophy, a practical man. He believed that an idea without a schedule is a fantasy. So here is the schedule. The first thing in the morning, before the phone, before the news, before the inbox, before any external input has a chance to set the frequency of the mind for the day, spend 30 minutes in deliberate construction of the mental image of your definite major purpose. Read the written statement. See the specific number. Feel the specific date. Visualize in as much sensory detail as you can generate the life that corresponds to the achievement of that purpose. Not the money as an abstraction, but the specific texture of the life the money makes possible, the house if that is part of it. The freedom of schedule. The face of the child who will inherit a different story. The exact feeling in the palms of the hands on the day the target is reached. Hold that image with the full force of your attention for 30 minutes, and when the mind wanders, as it will, return it. Not with frustration. With the patient authority of a person who understands that this wandering is simply the old blueprint asserting itself, and that each return to the image is an act of reprogramming. Then, and only then, turn to the management of the day. The problems, the obligations, the work that needs to be done, but do so from inside the orientation that the 30 minutes has established. From inside the understanding that this day's work is not an end in itself, but a step in a construction project whose destination is specific and certain. In the evening, before sleep, return to the written purpose. Read it again. Feel it again. Give the subconscious mind its final instruction for the night, which is the most important instruction of all, because the hours of sleep are when the subconscious does its deepest processing. The mind that goes to sleep rehearsing scarcity does its deepest work in the direction of scarcity. The mind that goes to sleep rehearsing abundance does its deepest work in the direction of abundance. CC. This is the compounding that matters more than any financial instrument available to a person without capital. It is the compounding of internal orientation, and it is available, right now, at zero financial cost, to every single person listening to this. The third element of daily practice is the deliberate management of the social environment. This does not require dramatic ruptures with the people in a person's life. It requires the addition of new inputs that raise the ambient frequency of the mind. One book per month from the library of those who have built what you're building. One relationship, however tentative at first, with a person who is operating at the level you intend to reach. One regular conversation, whether in person or in the expanding world of virtual connection, in which the language of possibility is the default rather than the language of limitation. And over time, as the internal blueprint shifts, as the subconscious begins to accept the new dominant belief, the external environment will begin to reflect it. The people who appear in the life will be different. The opportunities that present themselves will be different. The quality of the decisions that the mind generates will be different. Not because the world has changed, but because the instrument through which the world is perceived has changed. This is the law Hill documented. This is the law that 500 of the most consequential financial lives of the modern era confirmed, from the inside, through their own testimony. This is the law that the vast majority of people will go to their graves, never applying, not because it was unavailable to them, but because they never believed it applied to them specifically. Let it apply to you. Make that decision now, in this moment, with whatever degree of certainty you can currently access, knowing that certainty will grow with practice, the way a muscle grows with use. Because the alternative is not neutral. The alternative is not simply the continuation of the current situation. The alternative is the compounding of the current situation in the direction it is already pointing. And the end point of that trajectory, calculated honestly, is not a destination anyone who is listening to this would choose if they were choosing freely and consciously. You're choosing freely and consciously right now. The 70-30 rule is the decision to give the larger portion of yourself, of your mental energy, of your daily attention, of your subconscious instruction, to the life you're building rather than the life you're managing. It is the decision to be a creator of financial reality rather than a manager of financial circumstances. It is the decision to give your children not a balance in an account, though that matters too, but something far more durable and far more transferable. A living demonstration that the mind deliberately directed is the only real source of wealth there is or ever has been. Hill said it this way, and he said it with the authority of a man who had sat with Carnegie and Ford and Rockefeller and asked them the hardest questions and received the most honest answers. Whatever the mind of man can conceive and believe, it can achieve, not whatever the economy permits. Not whatever the family background allows, not whatever the current circumstances suggest is realistic. Whatever the mind can conceive and believe. The conceiving is the definite major purpose. The believing is the subconscious blueprint, reprogrammed through consistent autosuggestion, through the mastermind, through the daily practice of giving 70% to creation. And the achieving follows. It follows with the inevitability of a mathematical law. Not on any particular timeline that the impatient ego would prefer, but with a certainty that Hill documented in 500 lives and that every person who has applied this methodology with real discipline has confirmed in their own. The question is not whether it works. The only question that remains, is whether you will work it. Whether you will do the 30 minutes in the morning, not once or twice in a burst of inspiration, but every day with the quiet, relentless commitment of a person who has decided, at a level beneath mood and circumstance, that the story they are living is going to change. And underneath that question, still unanswered, still vibrating with the weight it has carried since the very beginning of this conversation, is the one we started with, the one about the cage. Here's the answer. The cage was never locked from the outside. The lock was always internal. It was always a belief, absorbed before you had the language to question it, rehearsed into the architecture of the subconscious until it felt like a fact about the world, rather than an opinion about yourself. And the key, the only key that has ever existed, is the one Hill spent his life forging from the testimony of the people who used it. It is the decision to take conscious possession of the dominant thought in the mind, to replace the inherited broadcast with a chosen one, to give 70% of the available mental energy every single day to the image of what is being built. That is not a small thing. It is in fact the only thing. It is the thing that separates the life of financial freedom from the life of financial servitude. It is the thing that separates the legacy from the cautionary tale. It is the thing that your children will either inherit as a living practice or mourn as a missed possibility. The door is open. It has always been open. And the only question that has ever mattered is whether you will walk through it. Begin tomorrow morning. Begin with 30 minutes. Begin with a number and a date and a service and a plan. Begin with the written statement that you will read aloud with full emotional engagement, twice a day, until the subconscious accepts it as a command. Begin with the understanding that every day you delay is a day in which the old blueprint compounds, a day in which the children absorb a little more of the story you're trying to change, a day in which the window that is not infinite narrows by a fraction. And begin with the knowledge that the man who spent 20 years sitting across from the wealthiest minds in human history, asking them how they did it, documented the answer with a clarity and a completeness that leaves no room for the excuse that it is not available to you. It is available. It has always been available. The 70-30 rule is not a secret kept by the wealthy. It is a law, as available and as impersonal as gravity, waiting to be applied by anyone with the courage and the consistency to apply it. That person can be you. Hill said so. The evidence of 500 lives says so. And somewhere in the base of your throat, in that specific place where wanting and believing meet, you already know it is true.